It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted you're here. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. It is February 2019, and we are trying to survive a little ice storm. Been a heck of a winter. We've had some super hot days, and then some really super cold days, and at a short-term period of about 4 or 5 days, we went from an overnight low with wind chill of minus 54 to a daytime high of 50. So that's a personal record for me, 104-degree difference in just a few days. So exciting times. And like I said, the newest thing is ice. Yesterday on Monday, my wife and I snuck out before the ice and went to the Chicago Auto Show. And I don't know about you, but this was the first time I've ever been to an auto show. And I don't know exactly what I expected, but I don't think I got it. And maybe it's just me. I'm not that into cars in general. And as I mentioned on the previous episode, I'm considering a replacement vehicle, and I look for utilitarianism. I guess that's the right word. I want a car that does things. I want a car that has the smallest car possible with the biggest amount of cargo space. It's very important for me to use as little gas as possible, but that doesn't appear to be what the auto show is all about. Several manufacturers were not even there, but you know, the really, really big ones were mostly there. Mercedes-Benz decided to show up only and promote business trucks. I mean, like cargo vans and bigger, really big stuff. And a lot of it felt kind of like a show of mine's bigger than yours marketing kind of thing. I was also surprised by the people that were working the show, the staff in each company's space, Toyota, Hyundai, GM. They were all very pretty people, but they didn't really seem to know about the vehicles. I would go up and ask questions, and they would very quickly run to grab me a sheet of paper that had some stats on it or a big fancy glossy brochure, but often didn't know real details about the car. And they can have a lot of models, and it's something that salespeople have a problem with when you have 20 or 30 different models to sell. If you come in as a studied customer, if you've gone on the web and done some research, you can easily know more about a specific car than they do, and that's kind of the way the world works. But they didn't seem to really know much about anything. Several places were having skits where a couple people would act out taking a vacation with their dog Skippy in this brand new big vehicle, and how safe it was, and how many airbags it had, and how many cup holders it had. Again, you would often be told all the colors you could choose from. And that's one of those things that always bugs me, is that I don't know about everybody else, but I don't buy a car because it has the color that I want. I generally don't care, and people that care are quick to point out that I drive Priuses, which is proof that I don't care, and I don't. I want anyway. I have different goals, I guess. Almost everyone there had very few hybrids. Almost no one had any electric vehicles. The Chevy part did have the Bolt with a B for boy, because GM named the Bolt the same as the Volt, just the first letter is different. So they did have one that you could look at, but again, the couple people that we found didn't seem to know much about it. And because we were there on Monday, there weren't a ton of people there, which is nice because we could look at the cars, but it still seemed like they didn't have enough staff. So I wonder how bad it was over the weekend. We did find a Hyundai, oh my gosh, now I can't remember the name of it, Kona EV, and sat in that, and that has much smaller space inside than the Chevy Bolt EV. So that was kind of a bummer. I tried to sit in the back seat and could not physically fit my foot between the seats. I mean, I could get it in if I kept it at about a 30-degree angle off of going straight, but at no point could I make it straight. So the distance between the floor, or the framing for the back seat and the framing for the front seat, was less than 12 inches, because that's about the length of my shoe. So that's not a whole lot of space. Anyway, so generally, Auto Show didn't impress me. And one of the things I thought that they should have is not just how many miles per gallon a car has, but how much it costs to put the gasoline in it over a lifetime. So just for laughs, I did something like this, because my favorite car that I own currently is a Prius Prime, which is a plug-in, and it gets the first 25 miles on electricity. And then after that, it gets about 54 miles per gallon. You can also buy a Prius Eco, which gets a couple more miles per gallon. So I just did some quick calculations, assuming you can drive a car 250,000 miles over its lifetime, and then assuming that the average price of a gallon of gas is $2.50. And if gas goes up, these numbers become bigger, of course. You may live in an area where gas is already quite a bit over $2.50, although we've seen some places here that it's been under $2 for a few days. But just real quick, if you can get 50 miles per gallon, and this is very few cars, the total cost of gasoline over the life of the vehicle is $12,500. If you get only 40,000, it does go up a little bit. It's not too bad. It goes from $12,500 to $15,625. 30 miles a gallon goes to $20,800. 20 miles a gallon, $31,000. If you get one of the big trucks from the auto show, and there were tons of them, some of them had 15 miles per gallon. And if you actually got the 15 miles per gallon, you would spend $41,666. Ooh, $41,666 on gasoline. So the difference is almost $30,000 between getting 50 miles per gallon and 15 miles per gallon. So if you need the truck for business, fine, cool, get a big truck. But I see a lot of people driving great big honking trucks that they don't need a great big honking truck. And over a 10 or 12 year lifespan, 250,000 miles of driving, you will spend $30,000 more just on gasoline. And this is one of the things I look at with a Chevy Bolt as an example, or a Tesla. I'm going to see if I can test drive one, but I'm not really inclined, because the Model 3, from what I've seen online, again, not being in one in person, has nothing on the dash except for a giant screen in the center, which looks really cool, but in a way it doesn't. In my Prius Prime, one of the biggest complaints that I had is that too much was on the screen. Well, in the Tesla, everything is on the screen, it looks like, again, having not sat in one. I really miss having the little dial where I can turn up the volume quickly or slowly or down. And I really like a dial where I can change the radio stations, or at least convenient buttons. And if everything is on the screen, you have to go through menus and sub-menus like you do on your phone, but you're doing that while you're driving. So sometimes it actually is a little harder than just having a panel of buttons that you've learned where they are, and you can just reach for them and tactily feel them while keeping your eyes on the road. The other fantasy I have with an electric vehicle is that there's no oil changes. The brakes should last the entire life of the car. You never have to do brake work because of what's called regenerative. Yeah, it's too early in the morning. Regenerative braking, magnetic braking. You don't use the physical pads and drums very much, so they might last the entire life cycle of the car. So you're not doing that. So we have no oil changes, no brake work, no gas. A lot of those things add up to save even more money than what you can spend just on gasoline in a very big vehicle. The other thing that I found amazing about the auto show is that in a few places I would stop and talk to people about hybrids and or EVs, electric vehicles, and not only did they not know much at all about the specific vehicles, they didn't really know how EVs worked, and often the information they had was just flat out wrong. A couple different people said, well, EVs will never really be a big thing because they cost more to fill up than gasoline costs, which is flat out wrong. As I had said earlier in my calculation, I used $2.50 for a gallon of gas. Depending on your local electricity rate, you can pay as little as $1 for the amount of electricity that will get you the same distance that a gallon of gas will. And I did this calculation for the Chevy Bolt just to, amuse myself. And my rates are not the cheapest. It's about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. It would cost me about $1.10, $1.20 to $1.40 for about 50 miles. So that's the efficiency of electric vehicles. The problem, of course, is the higher upfront costs and the little bit of range anxiety if the car doesn't go very far. But if you have more than one vehicle, you can have one that has limited range that you do all your errands, you drive to work if you don't work too far away, and then you have another car where, from time to time, if you go somewhere longer, you take that car. Anyway, enough ranting on about cars. Not something I often talk about on the show, but I would love to hear your input. I already had several people contact me about different cars. Of course, there's the obligatory listeners that tell me I have to go look at the Tesla. And then I actually had a couple of people that own Chevy Bolts already, because I have a lot of really smart listeners apparently. And they've told me all about their experiences, good and a few bad. But if you know something more about these kind of vehicles, you may feel free to contact me, Phil@PolarisFinancialPlanning.com. In the Investing Skeptically segment today, we're going to talk about bonds and the different types of bonds and bond mutual funds, bond index funds. So that's something we haven't covered in a while. And then the interview later is Helaine Olen, and she's been on the show in the past, and she has written a couple books about investing basics, the scams that run in an investing world. And no big surprise, she's going to agree with a lot of things that I talk about what to avoid, how to invest, things like that. So we're going to talk to her, and we do talk about investments, but we do get into some current events and politics. And again, not too surprisingly, she agrees with me on a lot of things, but you may need to find someone that loves Trump to come on. What do you guys think? Would that be a good idea? I don't think I'll do it. He gets too much promotion. Oh, and by the way, we're on the verge of another government shutdown. Apparently there's a deal, so we'll see what happens, but I don't know. It's just a bizarre world to think that setting aside 800,000 people and not paying them for a while is a good way to solve anything. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get on with the show. Today's Investing Skeptically is on bond funds. So an email from a listener, and I love this. I've also been wondering, how do bond funds work? Great question. And of course, like many things, it's complicated. The person who wrote this also goes on and says, particularly in short-term bonds, wouldn't selling mature bonds just yield the dividends? And of course, assuming they're not being defaulted on. So how do the share prices go up and down? So bond funds, of course, separate from all the stock funds that we've talked about probably in a week or two previous to this, the bond funds will buy bonds. And there is way more types of bonds that you can buy than there are types of stocks. So bond funds can do almost anything. Again, like when I talked about stock funds, bond funds can do almost anything unless the management team has decided it's going to do a specific type of bond. So first you can have, in a brokerage firm or an IRA, you can have often a cash account. And that cash sits there and it probably makes nothing or really close to nothing. You can have a cash account that pays you a little bit of interest, probably right now 0.5% maybe. And then you can have a money market account. And a money market fund, technically, a money market fund is a very specific type of a bond fund. Most people don't realize that, but a money market fund is a type of bond fund. And it's very special because it's very, 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 very short term bonds. And there's actual regulations on this that you have to have very high quality bonds. You can't buy junk bonds generally. I think that's pretty sure that's a rule. I know that you cannot get bonds that have maturity dates longer than 13 months from the day that you buy them. And that the average weighted maturity of the money market fund must be 60 days or less. And so you have a bond maybe that pays 4% for 4 years. That cannot be in the money market fund until it has 13 months left. And maybe it gets bought at 90 days left or 60 days left or 30 days left. So a money market fund has a lot of turnover and it has a lot of expense. But the nice thing about it is that when a money market fund shows you that its yield is, say, 2%, 2.5%, you're pretty much going to get 2.5%. The current yield is about what you're going to make. And this goes to the question from the listener, don't you get just the yields? Yes, with really, really short-term bonds, you get just the yields. Now, there's also, I've seen very short-term, ultra short-term, and they also use another phrase, floating rate funds. And again, all these can have different names and do something different than what their name implies. So you have to know what you're buying. You have to read the details. But generally, short-term bond funds are considered to have maturities or duration of under 5 years. And duration is a mathematical calculation that will inform you on how much this fund might be affected by changes in interest rates. So I'm going to use an example here. This is the fund VBIRX. VBIRX. This is the Vanguard Short-Term Government Bond Fund. And again, I'm using this fund because I'm familiar with this fund, and I know that it's buying only short-term bonds, and it's buying only U.S. government bonds. And then it's only buying like T-bills, treasuries, notes, and everything that have only a short period of time left. It's not buying tips generally, although I think it can be allowed to. And it's going to have something like 98% U.S. government bonds. So it's very, very clean and very tight, and it does what the name implies. The current yield is 2.97, but in calendar year 2018, it returned 1.35%. So you got the yield. It actually does pay out the dividends of about 2.97 currently, although at the beginning of 2018, that yield was probably closer to 2.5 or 2.4, and interest rates are going up. And so some of the bonds that they have decrease in value because they're not worth as much when interest rates go up. Just as a quick example, if you own a bond that pays 3%, and I can go buy a new bond that has every other factor the same length of time till payment, the same risk profile, the same guarantees and assurances that I'm going to get my money, and instead of paying 3%, it pays 4%, which one would you want to put your new money into? You want to buy the 4% bond, not the 3% bond. So as that bond approaches maturity, it might be sold, or the mutual fund might sell it to an ultra short-term bond fund or to a money market fund because they have to buy these things, but its value goes down. Now, if you own a bond or multiple bonds, whatever the dollar value of a bond that you own, if you hold it to maturity, if it pays 3%, you are eventually going to get 3%. That's how it works. But bond funds, even really efficient bond index funds at Vanguard, have some turnover. As a matter of fact, the shorter the yield, the number of years to maturity, the more turnover there is going to be, in part because when they come due, they have to buy new bonds. So, like I said, this fund has an average duration of 2.7, which would tell you if interest rates go up 1 percentage point, you would expect the price of that mutual fund to go down 2.7 percentage points. So in the last year, if short-term interest rates went up about 1%, which they kind of did, you might expect to make the 2.5% you thought you were going to make at the beginning of the year minus about 2%, give or take. And so you ended up getting something less, in this case, still something positive. So the effect is not great, but the effect is there. The inverse effect is also true. So if you have 4% bonds and interest rates drop and now you can only get a 3% bond, your 4% bond becomes more valuable. And so in a time of falling interest rates, which often happens when the economy is getting soft or we are going into or already in or trying to recover from a recession, the United States government can cut the overnight rate, which affects the other rates, not directly, but it does affect them. If bond rates fall, your bond values go up and you can make a lot of money. And this is one of the reasons to own bonds as well as stock funds. However, right now, we are leaving ultra record low setting interest rates, at least in the United States, and quite frankly, many other countries of the world. And so as an example here, I'm going to look at another Vanguard fund. This one is VLTCX. This is the Vanguard Long-Term Corporate. Its current yield is now 4.86%, which is a big change from a year ago, because I think a year ago it was probably 3 to 3.25. So the yield has gone up quite a bit. But in part because of the increase in the yield and the increase in interest rates, and the fact that this is a long-term bond fund which has a duration of 13, this fund did not return a total of 4.86% as you would expect. It returned minus 7.8%. So if you have mutual funds, bond funds that are long-term bonds and or speculative, risky, low quality, high yield, junk bonds, if you have a mix of those things, and when you buy a bond fund, how do you know what's in it? You don't know. What are the restrictions of that mutual fund? Does it have restrictions? Can it really buy anything? And there's this temptation for bond funds. And if you just go meet an advisor, the advisor wants to put you into a bond fund that has a high yield. A lot of people are not happy with making 2 or 3% yield. They want a 5% yield or a 7% yield or an 8% yield. Well, someone somewhere thinks that those bonds are really risky. Now, the risk might be default, as in junk bonds, or the risk might be they're long-term bonds, and if interest rates go up, you could lose a lot of money. This is one of the reasons that currently, in 2019, I do not recommend, matter of fact, I recommend against owning intermediate and long-term bonds in general. Back in 2005, back in 2008, you could make 7 or 8% in long-term bonds. You made great money. And when the stock market fell in 2008 and interest rates fell over the next couple of years, we made a lot of money in long-term bonds. Not today. It's just not going to happen. Now, if Trump fucks it all up and we go into a recession and interest rates start to fall, I could be very quickly shown to be a fool and missed out the opportunity to get in long-term bonds while the rates were reasonable before they fell again. I don't think that's a high probability, but that's part of investing, is that you never know. If bonds get another 1 or 2% yield on them, I will tell you on the show, I will start informing you, hey, let's start looking at intermediate term bonds. Let's start looking at long-term bonds. I'm not there yet. And I'm definitely closer on corporate bonds than I am government bonds, because government bonds haven't really been hit yet. They've not had their yields go up. We have a very flat yield curve. Another topic for another show. So there's a lot of different types of bond funds. You can have short-term, intermediate term, long-term. You can have high quality. You can have moderate quality. You can have shitty quality. You can have bonds that are based on government-issued bonds from the United States or your country if you're in a different country. In the United States, you can have Ginnie Mae bonds, which are backed by a house. You can have international bonds, you can have emerging market bonds, and you can have, like I said, the junk bonds. So there's a lots of different types of bonds. And in any given year, we don't know for sure what's going to happen. And so some of the extremes here, I'm just going to look here. The best is the Vanguard Total International Bond Fund over the last 12 months, ending 12/31 of 18. It made 2.97%. That was the return. 3%, not so bad. And the worst one is the long-term corporate, which is minus 7.8. When interest rates are going up, bonds over the next couple of years, probably going to be kind of rough. But the reason most people own bonds now is because they have to have that cushion, because a 1 or 2% return in bonds is terrible unless you compare it to a 25% drop in the stock market. Then suddenly, 2% return looks fucking genius. So we have the cushion in case something really wonky happens to the stock market. That's what the cushion is for. Anyway, that's some information about bond funds, the different types of bond funds, and how interest rates affect them. And hopefully that helps you understand a little bit more.
If there is a God, if there is, I think most reasonable people might agree that he's at least incompetent and maybe, just maybe, doesn't give a shit. Doesn't give a shit, which I admire in a person and which would explain a lot of these bad results. So rather than be just another mindless religious robot, mindlessly and aimlessly and blindly believing that all of this is in the hands of some spooky, incompetent father figure who doesn't give a shit, I decided to look around for something else to worship, something I could really count on. And immediately, I thought of the sun. Happened like that. Overnight, I became a sun worshiper. Well, not overnight. You can't see the sun at night. But first thing the next morning, I became a sun worshiper. Several reasons. First of all, I can see the sun. Okay? Yeah. Unlike some other gods I could mention, I can actually see the sun. I'm big on that. If I can see something, I don't know, kind of helps the credibility along, you know? So every day I can see the sun as it gives me everything I need: heat, light, food, flowers in the park, reflections on the lake, an occasional skin cancer, but hey, at least there are no crucifixions, and we're not setting people on fire simply because they don't agree with us. Sun worship is fairly simple. There's no mystery, no miracles, no pageantry, no one asks for money, there are no songs to learn, and we don't have a special building where we all gather once a week to compare clothing. And the best thing about the sun, it never tells me I'm unworthy. Doesn't tell me I'm a bad person who needs to be saved. Hadn't said an unkind word. Treats me fine. So I worship the sun. But I don't pray to the sun. Know why? I wouldn't presume on our friendship. It's not polite. I've often thought people treat God rather rudely, don't you? Asking trillions and trillions of prayers every day, asking and pleading and begging for favors. Do this, give me that, I need a new car, I want a better job. And most of this praying takes place on Sunday, his day off. It's not nice, and it's no way to treat a friend. But people do pray, and they pray for a lot of different things. You know, your sister needs an operation on her crotch. Your brother was arrested for defecating in a mall. But most of all, you'd really like to fuck that hot little redhead down at the convenience store. You know, the one with the eye patch and the club foot, huh? Can you pray for that? I think you'd have to. And I say, fine, pray for anything you want. Pray for anything. But what about the divine plan? Remember that? The divine plan. Long time ago, God made a divine plan. Gave it a lot of thought, decided it was a good plan, put it into practice. And for billions and billions of years, the divine plan has been doing just fine. Now you come along and pray for something. Well, suppose the thing you want isn't in God's divine plan. What do you want him to do? Change his plan? Just for you? Doesn't it seem a little arrogant? It's a divine plan. What's the use of being God if every rundown schmuck with a $2 prayer book can come along and fuck up your plan? And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. fine. But if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why the fuck bother praying in the first place? Seemed like a big waste of time to me. Couldn't you just skip the praying part and go right to his will? It's all very confusing. So to get around a lot of this, I decided to worship the sun. But, as I said, I don't pray to the sun. You know who I pray to? Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investment should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship. All right, everybody, welcome back. I have with me today Helaine Olen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am well. Now, you've been on the show a couple of times over the years, but it's been a while, and we figured we could talk. And just because you have written a few books about investing, I want to get that out of the way, but we're not going to talk about them long because we've done that in the past. A couple of books here. The Index Card, Why Personal Finance Doesn't Have to Be Complicated, which I still love the fact that you wrote a book about the fact that everything you need to know is on an index card. And the other book, Pound Foolish, exposing the dark side of personal finance industry, which is right in my wheelhouse, as you know. Tell us a little bit about those books and why my listeners should go buy copies right away.
Oh, first of all, they're really great. So my publisher says I have to say that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Pound Foolish, Exposing the Dark Side of the Personal Finance Industry is really the story of how we were sold on the idea that personal finance and investment culture could save people from the age of income and wealth inequality, and that when you didn't get ahead in this world, as most of us have not for a long time, we would then, it was all our fault. That was the book. And it has resonance to this day, obviously, because we all know this game very well, right? Oh, you have student loans? That's your fault, right? It's your parents should have saved for you to go to college, or you should have gone to a cheaper college, right? Never mind the fact that a lot of people who take out student loans are going to local colleges, okay? And so I wrote that, and that's been around for a couple of years. But one of the questions that came out of it was, why, what should we do, right? Because you might be right, but we all have 401ks, and we all need to figure out who we can trust in the finance industry. We do need to save money for retirement. What do we do? And I felt that was something of a legitimate question, right? I mean, when I wrote Pound Foolish, I had been a personal finance writer in the past, and I felt for sure I would never, ever be invited to write about personal finance again, right? Because I basically said 98% of this stuff is absolute junk. Instead, what happened was everybody then trusted me to tell them the unvarnished truth. So I really became the person you went to with your 401k questions after that, right? Because Helaine will tell you the truth. And to be fair, I do feel people really do need help with this stuff, right? And so when Harold Pollack came up with the idea for the index card, I was beyond thrilled to write it with him. And and that's basically the simple, easy rules for personal finance and what you need to do.
Yeah.
And, I think it's definitively needed, as do readers, because it's still around and still kicking. And I get questions about the book easily several times a week.
So obviously it's index cards because the idea was written on an index card, but just real quick, thumbs up or thumbs down on index funds?
I am always a huge fan of index funds. I say it with the caveat of I think a lot of people, especially people who've come into this in the past 10 years, of which there are now a lot, right? This has really been the age of the index fund. I was about to say the index card, that too, okay? Again, it's a great book. No, I'm kidding. That people have really gotten the idea that this is kind of a guaranteed investment scheme, right? The market always goes up, average annual return is 7 to 8%, blah, 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 blah. And yes, that has been history, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen beginning tomorrow, right? Things can change. And I say this not to depress the living hell out of everybody listening to this broadcast, because I certainly hope that doesn't happen. I myself have my money in index funds. But to say that there are no guarantees in this world. And I think that these things have, and I don't feel like Vanguard has done this, by the way, and I don't think John Bogle did this. I want to put that out there. But I do think this idea has sort of crept out there that this is a definitive guarantee, and, it's just not, because nothing in life is guaranteed.
Absolutely. So hopefully no one gets that idea. Now, of course, in both of those books, one of the things that you've talked about are some of the problems and bad investments out there. What jumps to mind? What do you think is a really good way to lose money? What's a bad investment?
Oh God, there's so many out there. Going to a financial advisor who does not have your best interests at heart.
Fair enough.
And legally, there's a legal term for this called fiduciary, is a really good way to lose money, in my experience. And there are all sorts of investments. I mean, I get constant emails from people who are being pitched on various whole life insurance schemes. Good way to not make money. Falling for various scams. Falling for I can beat the market. That's always a really good way to lose money, because we know that over time, almost nobody can consistently beat the markets.
Well,
right? That's the other thing I should say, to go back to the index fund question for a second, because there's one other point I really wanted to make, which is, yes, index funds can go down, right? Remember this, they can go down. But just because the markets go down doesn't mean the thing that was being peddled to you as a better investment won't actually do worse, right? There's always this idea out there that there's somebody who can save you, right? That my guy knows this. Teresa Ghilarducci, who's the big retirement, guru, loves always pointing to how people have my guy, right?
Yeah.
And there's this idea that will save you. I know somebody who knows, the markets are going down. This is what you could invest in, right? In fact, your investment could actually do worse than so if the market goes down 10%, your chosen investment could go down 20%. Like, there's no guarantee it's going to do better than the market at any point. But the studies all show that, in fact, year in and year out, less than 1% of us have any ability to outguess the markets, especially after expenses are taken into account.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've seen a lot lately, I don't know if you've seen any of this, I've been getting a lot of emails and pitches from bazillion industries promoting uncorrelated investments. And most of them are very conservative and basically make you nothing. And so when the market goes up and down a lot, making nothing, like money in your mattress, is uncorrelated. And it's the most fascinating thing that they're playing on this idea that there's no correlation, but you're basically making nothing.
Right. I mean, I get those. I mean, a few years ago, I actually figured out on Gerber Baby Life Insurance, if you remember that, you would actually do better putting your money in a mattress. I'm not kidding.
I don't doubt
literally
it.
taking the money and putting it in a mattress.
Well,
okay?
if you have anything rigorous on that, I would love to do a segment on that. And of course, if I can cheat and read off your notes, I'd do that. But
I Google me, or I'll forward it to you. I wrote the piece a couple of years ago.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and but I get those, and on the other extreme, I get another extreme too, the cryptocurrency stuff.
You've been listening to the show, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, the number of young men, because it's particular young men,
yes, it's true,
who say things to me along the lines of, I'm afraid of the stock market, so I'm buying Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, is astonishing to me. And I can't figure this one out to save my life, because common sense says this is much more, sketchy / risky than putting your money in the S&P 500, okay?
Well, recently...
This is like a really insane position to take. And, I mean, some people are going to do well, but a lot of people are not.
Yeah.
I get it. I get people want to take chances. I don't want to be the scold here. But the part that gets me is the sheer number of people who actually think it's safer. That's the part that blows my mind, because I don't know where you could be getting that from except the industry peddling this stuff.
Well, it was funny because just recently I did an episode or a segment on the debacle in Canada where $190 million is lost on a laptop because the guy died. And it just so happens that luckily December 22nd of 2017, I did 2 hours going over the details of how Bitcoin works, and I put that out 4 days after the peak of Bitcoin, where I very, very affirmatively declared to anybody, if you owned it, get out now, run. So yeah, it's been an ongoing theme. People send me emails all the time, and I was just looking, but like you said, we write for the Washington Post, and I pulled up here. In the past, you have written for Inc., The Nation, Forbes, and a few other magazines, The Guardian.
Yeah, I get around.
Yeah. So that's nice. And you did mention the fiduciary word. So let's do that a little bit. Talk about how Trump is handling the new fiduciary regulations. What's going on there?
What fiduciary regulations? Okay, so where we were last, right? ...
Yeah.
When the Obama administration ends, I feel like a television show, right? Catching you up after a 6-month hiatus. When the Obama administration ends, we are all set to have regulations on retirement accounts saying that anyone who gives you advice on your retirement investment has to have a fiduciary duty to you. That is a legal ability to act in your best interest. Or actually, I should say at the time of the election, because right after the election, a Texas court stays these rules, right? And eventually, after much goings on, Texas court, stays these rules. The Trump administration says, we don't want to deal with this. Somebody in the Trump administration compares the fiduciary rules to, horrors in history, and they end up just scrapping the whole thing, basically. So, this basic 7-year effort by the Obama administration ends going nowhere. So at the moment, we are back to where we were, which is when you seek investment advice, the people who you seek investment advice for retirement savings have, can be, put their work to something called the suitability standard, which basically allows them to put their own interests, in league with yours, and they can recommend less than stellar investments as long as they aren't truly subpar. There is some movement, to be fair, out of the SEC to try to change this for traditional brokerage accounts now, but it looks like it's going to be much milder than the original Obama regulations were, and more industry friendly, is another way to put that. And
it's one of those things.
It might not even happen, right?
I see that as
on the slow pike. Basically.
Yeah, I see it as it's a common sense no brainer, but whatever. It's not the world that we live in. And the weird thing, in a strange way, if that rule passed, it would be a little harder for me in business because I would have competition. Because I am a fiduciary, it's really, really easy to look at accounts from other people that have terrible, terrible investments and do better for them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One of the recent things you had in the Washington Post, segue here, you talked about Starbucks, you talked about the latte factor and Howard Schultz. Why don't you flesh that out for us?
Oh, well, you want me to talk about Howard Schultz first or Social Security? I could talk about both. I am aghast about Howard Schultz running. And I should say I've been aghast since he was initially making noises as running as a Democrat. So this isn't just totally about the fact I think he could throw the election to Trump. I think there's an even bigger issue involved here, and that is whatever party he's running in. One thing we should have all learned from the past 2 years, if we hadn't figured it out previously, is that running a business gives you no background whatsoever to run in the United States. right? This is two incredibly different concepts. One, business. You're the CEO. You can kind of sort of do whatever you want, right? Your limitations are you got to act within the best interests of your company. So if you wake up one morning and you want to just jettison, say, a healthy latte that isn't selling very well, you can completely do that, right? If it has passionate fans, who cares, right?
Right.
You're in charge. You're the dictator, right? Again, as long as you don't do anything, that causes shareholders to sue you, you're basically okay. And that's really a hard thing to do, by the way. So running a country, completely different thing, right? You are the executive branch. There is judicial, there is legislative, there are all sorts of various stakeholders. These people need to be made happy. You don't give them what they want, bad things happen. Donald Trump learned this, by the way, during the shutdown, right?
Did he?
He went nowhere.
Did he learn that?
Well, he should have learned it. Actually, you are correct.
Yeah.
You just corrected me, okay? He should have learned this, right? It does not appear he did.
He's not very good at learning.
Right. I mean, it is a completely different concept, right? And then so there's no preparation, right? There's no comparison. Americans like to compare business and government. It's like a little tick we have as a country. It's absolutely untrue, okay? But there's a bigger question here too, which is why do we like this so much? And, if you really think about it, it actually is kind of about the lure of authoritarianism, right?
Yes,
it's
it is.
Kind of this idea that somebody's going to come in and, to use the old line about Mussolini, they're going to make the trains run on time, right?
Yeah.
Through this messy democracy BS, right? We're going to, I'm in charge and I'm going to make things work. And that's kind of how a CEO functions. And when people say that's what they, when they want a CEO, without even realizing it a lot of the time, that's what they're saying. They want someone to come in and take charge. They don't want to deal with this messy democracy BS where you've got to make everybody at least, if not ecstatically happy, they all have to be satisfied. You have to take into account their feelings, what they want, what they need. That's hard stuff. I mean, and, and I'd say the third point is, of course, that the CEO kind of plays into this trope of the past 40 years where we've, kind of worshipped wealth for wealth's sake. An age that mercifully seems to be coming to an end, by the way.
It does, and that's on my list of topics. But before we move, finish Howard Schultz, and then let's do Social Security.
Okay. And so, this sort of worship of I made money, therefore I am qualified,
yep.
Is just kind of really? It doesn't really make sense. But if you want to come back to this, we'll come back to this. So anyway, Social Security, it's a tangential relationship to Howard Schultz, I should say, is I wrote a column, what Phil is referring to is I wrote a column. There are now proposals in Washington. There's going to be another one coming down this week from another senator to increase Social Security and stabilize the Social Security system. And the one I wrote about was Representative Larson's, where he's been promoting this idea for years that will give an increase in Social Security, which is going to be needed, by the way.
Yes. Because,
as we know, younger baby boomers, Gen X, have not really saved adequate amounts for retirement as a group. And at the same time, stabilize the Social Security system by doing a very small increase in the taxation rate on income for Social Security. And basically, it would cost the typical worker about 50 cents a week, which is about not even 1/5 of a latte at this point, right? So Larson's taken to going around promoting this, carrying a coffee mug, and saying, this is less than than the latte, which many of us also often buy, right? And, as I joked in the Washington Post, finally somebody has found a use for the latte factor that actually makes sense. It is not offensive. It isn't scolding of people. This whole idea, the latte factor, for all of you who've been under rocks for the past 20 years, is the idea that you give up a small luxury like a latte, and you put your $5 a day in a savings account. Nothing bad will ever happen to you in this lifetime. You will have a stock market return of about 10 to 12%, because this is what the math indicates, and you will retire a millionaire.
Yeah, it is a grotesquely oversimplified thing, the latte factor. So we'll let the listeners look that up, because we've got so much for you to talk about. Let's see, the other thing we have here in a recent post, tax increases, which is what you just kind of alluded to here, this change in wealth for wealth's sake. I am continually stunned, and I was very vocal about it, even though I actually did quite well with the tax cuts, but people that aren't making a whole lot of money didn't really get much. What do you think about the tax cuts, and where are we going next?
Well, the latest with the tax cuts is, word's starting to come down that people are not getting the refunds they wanted, they were expecting. Surprise, surprise. And they're really angry. This was all predicted about a year ago by any number of people, including myself.
And myself.
This has been, the tax cuts.
It's easy to see.
Cuts, actually, first of all, I need to correct something here. They are not tax cuts. The proper word to use is tax reform. The reason we don't say tax cuts is because for a lot of people, they're a tax increase, okay?
Right.
I say this particularly sensitive to this issue living in New York, which was one of the places that's really gotten hurt by this, right?
And
you can have an argument for the next 10 years about whether state and local taxes should be able to be written off on federal taxes, but the fact of the matter is when Trump did this and the Republicans did this in this way, this was essentially a weaponization of the tax code.
I agree.
That punished people living in areas that are particularly opposed to Donald Trump, right, and the Republican Party, because the areas that got whacked the most are New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Washington metropolitan area, San Francisco, L.A., Seattle. I'm trying to think of a few other very high
Chicago.
prices. Chicago. Right. And these are all areas that were particularly opposed to Donald Trump. And and that's just sort of horrifying. There's, even if you think there are legitimate issues of whether these things should be able to be written off or not, this is not the way you do them, okay? But secondarily, there's something else going on here. Which is that the whole thing was always a scam, right? Most people got a very minor cut. That cut is set to expire in 2025. The cuts that are large and perpetual are the cuts that go to the tippy top of earners.
Right.
So the inheritance tax is now at in double digits. There are ways to set up pass-through corporations so that your income is taxed at a lower level. Professionals, by the way, again, a group that generally did not vote Republican. I'm talking lawyers, doctors, writers, are exempt from that. They're not considered eligible. This is, the group that really made out, shocking to discover, are his real estate interests.
Yeah, real estate and hedge funds.
Yeah. And by the way, the thing Donald Trump campaigned on, that he was going to repeal carried interest, which, impacts hedge fund people, somehow that never made it in. I mean, the scams of Donald Trump are endless and, again, were entirely predictable and were predicted by many people. Again, I'm not patting myself on the shoulder, or the head. I was one of many to say it.
We can't be too proud for being right, because it was pretty easy to see, I think. It just scared me and still scares me that people don't see it.
Yeah, the guy's been a serial scam artist since the day he showed up. So, how people don't see it is kind of beyond me at this point. I mean, I admit in New York it was a little easier than elsewhere because we all kind of knew that, you just have to drive out to Brooklyn or Queens to see the Trump buildings that were built by his father. I mean, so we kind of know, immediately, this guy's a scam artist. He didn't do it himself.
Right.
But he's declared bankruptcy. It's actually so many times I actually have to look it up when his companies, when I write about it. I think it's 6 times. He obviously is, running, some sort of, at the very best, a marketing thing, where he markets out his name. At the worst, and these allegations were again out there before the election, there's no small amount of cash laundering involved. The number of, hidden corporations that have bought apartments in his building is kind of staggering. And the amount of Russian money in these buildings is kind of staggering. And, it's not, Ma and Pa Kettle are not buying apartments in the Trump buildings.
Yeah, it is truly amazing. And I'm trying to keep us going, which is good because we wanted to kind of keep this to half an hour, but we could probably talk all day. Another segment, another Washington Post article, again, something I've talked about a little bit, but separating families. And apparently the Department of Justice, I think it was, came out and said, yeah, we're basically never going to be able to reunite those kids. Right. I mean, a couple of things happened.
First, very unnoticed, last month, HHS came out and basically said, we separated a lot more families than we copped to before. Because this had been going on for longer. And to be fair, this has been back to the Obama administration, okay? So
Correct.
Before anybody calls me up all angry or emails me or texts me or whatever, right? Because I've been hit all these different ways. Let me put that out there. This was going on for a while. It was the Trump administration, though, that made it a policy and began doing it routinely. So the court orders involved in this only, cover from a few months, basically. And from when it became a policy to simply separate every family. Prior to that, the families would be separated if somebody deemed the parent, a danger in some way or said the child was in danger in some way. But the Trump administration was, taking that standard and interpreting it rather liberally from the day they showed up, basically, as the Trump administration. Something the Obama administration was not doing. They had a harder line on it. They shouldn't have been doing it either, again, but. So apparently, prior to making this routine, several thousand families were also separated. We actually still don't quite know the correct number. We just know that the government has actually admitted in court filings that it's been several thousand. And that, like with the others, was very little effort made to, keep track of who belonged to who and who went where and whose kid belonged to what parent. And and now they're basically throwing their hands up and we can't solve this, right? In other words, we did it, we're all stuck. Which is just heinous.
We can't solve it, and if we tried, it would be hard, and we don't want to bother.
Right, yeah, basically, too bad. That's literally what these filings basically say, right? If you boil it down. It's basically, too bad, screw off. This is just really horrible. It's kind of a crime against humanity. There's kind of no way around it. How would you feel, right, if it was your kid, right? And it's just something that, you can't really stop thinking about once you start thinking about it. It's one of the worst things that has happened under the Trump administration, an administration of which horrible things happen every single goddamn day.
Well, it's an interesting thing because one of the concerns that I hear is people coming in and bringing children or getting pregnant and having children here. Well, now you have all the children and you have no parents to make money for them. So, they're going to be a large part of them. Some go with friends and family, but a large part of them at some point are going to need more aid, and their parents aren't here working to pay any taxes to cover it.
Right. The other thing is some of these kids seem to have been, Catherine Joyce, who's a great journalist, and I will say a friend of mine, has done some reporting indicating that some of these kids seem to have been put up for adoption.
Oh.
Or put out to foster care to unrelated families.
And those might be some of the good cases, because when you can't account for where kids are or went, really dark things could happen.
Yeah, but on the other hand, these parents didn't consent to to adoptions or foster care either, right? Yeah. It's the whole thing is just sort of horrible, and it reads like, something, some evil genius and like a Vincent Price movie from the 1960s thought up, right? Oh, I'm so evil. I've got a bad idea. I've got a great bad idea. We're going to separate parents and their children at the border, right? And that's going to discourage them. I mean, the whole thing is like just horrifying. And it's horrifying that it has continued to go on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anything else that you want to cover? Because we've only got a minute and a half hour left. It went that fast. Hopefully you feel a little better because you got to vent. It's always good fun. What have we not covered that you want to discuss?
Oh, I don't know. What do you want me to talk about? I can talk for a few more minutes.
I don't know. I had this all paced out so we'd make the 30 minutes, and we did. So now I'm kind of stuck.
It's brilliant, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think of everything? What's going to happen next? You tell me.
Oh, I don't know, and it scares me, and I still see it that a good 30% of the population think Trump is doing a good job, and they're being constantly told by a company that's got a primary shareholder from Saudi Arabia, Fox News, I'm referring to, that keeps telling them that Trump is fantastic, and they're buying it, hook, line, and sinker. And Trump, at some point, one can hope it's less than 2 years, not 6, but he'll be gone. But those people are still around, and this desire for America to not have education, that somehow being educated is elite and makes you bad. These trends concern me deeply, and I know when AOC, Alexandria. I can't remember how to say her name.
Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. When she comes out with the 70% tax thing, people who are making $30,000, $40,000 a year are flipping out. And I want to grab them by the collar and shake them and explain to them, I'm sorry, odds are you're never, ever, ever going to make $10 million a year. You remember Joe the plumber?
Right.
And a lot of people think, hey, someday my day will come and I'll be making millions of dollars. Sure, it could happen. Odds are not strongly in your favor. The vast majority of people that are middle Americans are never, ever, ever, ever going to make $1 million a year, let alone $10 million a year. And as you and I know, in the financial planning world, the vast majority of people are never even going to be able to scrap together $1 million in a total portfolio.
Right.
But yet they defend the ultra rich and say that they should get tax cuts because it will trickle upon them.
Right. I mean, the one thing I will say that's been positive in the past year is it feels like we've kind of come to an end of an era on this, and not in practical terms yet, right?
Right.
But in popular thinking terms. The polls are showing consistently from the beginning that the majority of people saw through the tax reform scam. Polls show consistently that a majority of people, including a majority of Republicans, would like to see a 70% marginal tax rate on incomes, in excess of $10 million. So there does seem to be this sense that, people have finally figured out that trickle-down economics was kind of a scam as well,
yeah,
right?
Kinda.
That this idea that, if we cut taxes on top, the rich will spend so much money that, it'll grow all our personal economies or lift all our boats, whatever metaphor you want to use, is, people are less and less likely to fall for it. At the same time, however, you have this consistent minority, who either through suspension of disbelief, ideological priors, or just flat-out ignorance, doesn't want to believe, still believes, right? Because a lot of these people, as far as I can tell, who are ranting about the possibility of higher income taxes on, people earning in excess of $10 million a year, like Ocasio-Cortez would like to do. They don't seem to understand what a marginal tax rate is.
Yeah, you're right.
So, I mean, and again, I'm speaking anecdotally because I'm not sure anybody has really surveyed this, right? But it does seem like they don't have a clue that she's not talking about them. She's not talking about me, and she's not talking about you unless you have some money that I don't know about, okay? She's not talking about anybody any of us really know, right? And that seems to be a missing piece here, that, and that I can only believe on some level is deliberate misinformation being put out there.
And I think the world has a lot of that. And to circle back to one of the main topics of this show, investments, the vast majority of the financial services industry is not there to educate you. It's there to collect a fee from you. It's there to collect a commission from you. And
right. I mean, they're brokers.
Well. Yeah, they do it very well.
They call themselves financial advisors, which I always say is a junk term meaning nothing.
Yep.
It is not a legal term whatsoever. They're basically what, when I was growing up, you'd call a stockbroker, right? And that was like a fancy glorified term for salesman or saleswife, or occasionally a saleswoman, right? I'm old enough that it was still very rare to see women doing this. And that the idea that these people immediately have your best interests at heart, is again something that's just been marketed at you because most of them don't.
It is truly amazing. Well, Helaine, again, thank you for your time. I appreciate you being on the show very much. And, have a fantastic day.
Oh, thank you for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
The longer you live, the more you look around, the more you realize something is fucked up. Something is wrong here. War, disease, death, destruction, hunger, filth, poverty, torture, crime, corruption, and the ice-capades. Something is definitely wrong. This is not good work. If this is the best God can do, I am not impressed. Results like these do not belong on the resume of a supreme being. This is the kind of shit you'd expect from an office temp with a bad attitude. And just between you and me, in any decently run universe, this guy would have been out on his all-powerful ass a long time ago. And by the way, I say this guy because I firmly believe, looking at these results, that if there is a God, it has to be a man. No woman could or would ever fuck things up like this. So...
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, I do hope that you enjoyed the interview and learned a little something about bonds earlier on. One other thing I did want to cover, a listener had written me and asked about trading and making trades, and they asked it, when I make trades, do I set limits, and do I do all these fancy things that one can do when buying or selling stock or an ETF? Mutual funds, you don't have this capability. So the vast majority of trading I do is either with people adding money or taking out money, and the occasional rebalancing is almost always mutual funds and index mutual funds because that's what I do. However, there are people from time to time that show up with stocks or have a stock left over, and I might need to sell that. So the listener was asking about the different types of trades one can do. There's a lot of conditions and rules you can put on your trade. As an example, if the stock is currently $50 a share, you could put in an order or instructions to say, I'm not going to sell it until it gets to 52. So you get the most out of your share. The problem with any of that, of course, it could be $50 and then tomorrow it's $48. So you never sold it at 52. You never sold it at all because you're still holding it. And now trying to squeak out a couple of extra dollars, you ended up costing yourself a couple of dollars. And I think my general advice on that is don't, because anytime you're doing something other than strategically owning asset or asset classes, you're trying to make money from some other way other than just straight up investing and long-term investing. You're trying to make money in the short term. You're trying to figure out the best way to buy and sell. You're trying to figure out the best time to buy and sell. It's a slippery slope kind of thing down the road to looking at charts and saying, oh, it has a little head and shoulders dip and I should buy or sell on this day or I should sell on Friday. You're doing something other than what I'm recommending, which is long-term investing. So if you own too much of a specific stock and you want to sell some, just go sell it. You put in a market order, which means it sells at market. And hopefully if you have a good broker-dealer, good custodian, Schwab, T. Rowe Price, even Edward Jones, Merrill Lynch, those guys are going to execute at a reasonably good price. And I think this is one of the places where the apps may not serve you as well. You may get a pretty good execution price, but there's a thing called the spread, which is the difference in price between the buyer and seller and what the bids are. I'm not going to bore you with all that now, but just sell it. If you want to sell something, just sell it. If you want to buy something, just buy it. Hopefully the fractions of a penny or an extra dollar or two isn't going to change your world. The point is to add as much money as possible and do that for as long as possible. And once again, we have the Patreon page, patreon.com/Phil. You can go there to support the show. Just a quick recap. Any dollars that are given there in January, February, and March of 2019, an anonymous listener has agreed to double that amount, and then I'm going to double that amount up to $5,000. So again, if all the listeners donate to, an anonymous listener will double it. It becomes $4,000, and I will double it again for another $4,000. So $8,000 could go to American Atheists, and that money is going to be used to provide travel grants for students coming to the American Atheist Conference in the Easter weekend of 2019. So if you are a student, I think it would apply for high school and college both, contact American Atheists, ask about the travel grant program. You can tell them that you heard about it here on the Phil Ferguson Show, and maybe they can help set you up with a room that costs very little or next to nothing at the conference in Cincinnati, Ohio. And the nice thing about that location is pretty much anyone east of the Mississippi can drive to it. Of course, southern tip of Florida, and way up in Maine, it might be a long drive, but you could get there, bring some friends, bring your college classmates, bring your high school classmates. I'd love to see large groups of students because this movement can't be made of simply a whole bunch of old people. So college students, go contact American Atheists. If you know college students that might go, have them contact American Atheists, or you could call and find out more. The rate for students is really low. I'm afraid I don't know that number off my top of my head, but it's something like $25 or $50. And now with comp rooms, maybe all you have is a little bit of gas. And maybe, hopefully, you're driving a really fuel-efficient vehicle. So I hope to see you at the American Atheist Conference sometime soon, or some other conference. Until then, ciao.
are not appealing. In fact, I'm starting to get the uh-oh feeling. And my mama said my special parts are just for me. So why in the world are you trying to creep?
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square.
To try and touch my square takes a lot of nerve. Who do you think you are, you freaky deaky perv? There's a dude with some candy in a shady old van. I think he wants to mess with my purity plan.
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square.
those dirty little hands off me. Why won't you respect my privacy? I just want to be left all alone, so step off me and go back home. I tell you again, if you're not aware that this is my own no-no square.
Stop! Don't touch me there. This is my no-no square. Stop! Don't touch me there.